morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's really a pleasure to talk with you about the Dutch DNA. I'm not going to talk about education because I have not enough experience about that, but I will talk with you about Dutch DNA, the subject Ricardo Semler just mentioned. First of all, I would like to say that the Netherlands is actually a dot on the world map. It's really a very tiny country. But if you don't probably know that the Netherlands is actually on the top list of the world, not for 50 or for 100 years, but already for 400 years. And that is a huge achievement. There are not many countries who have done the same, and we owe this success thanks to our national genesis and to the fact that we have very interesting national characteristics. But there is maybe a potential problem, and that is that the Dutch often take this success for granted. They sometimes are not thinking enough about where this actually is coming from. They are not cherishing the sources of success. And sometimes they even don't know where the success is actually coming from. There was a recent survey in the Netherlands, and that 60% of the Dutch were proud or even very proud of their national history. But at the same time, a very large amount of people didn't have much knowledge or understanding of our past. And I feel sorry about that because there is something important going on. We have lived through an era of changes, and we are going to a change of era. So we are going to a completely new period in our history. And there will be many adjustments we have to make. So it is important to know our history. So I feel a little bit worried about that. At the end of my contribution, I will tell you more about the challenges we will have to face. But first, I would like to talk with you about the Dutch DNA. The fact is, as I just have said, that the Dutch have not much understanding of their history. It was treated like a stepchild at our schools. And that has to do with the fact that the Dutch are trading people, and we live in the present and not in the past. We are no conservers, we are actually explorers, so we are looking always for new chances. So it is important that we cherish the sources of our success, and we really have to think about it. But I think I'm not in the position to criticize the Dutch for this, because when I was young, I was not interested in the history of the Dutch as well. I was always focused on the world around me. I was a journalist, so I was looking at the large superpowers in the world. I was interested in the European countries, and not so much in the dot where I was actually living on, the Netherlands. And therefore, it was no surprise that I left the Netherlands and I went abroad. I stayed in Europe for 14 years in 5 countries, and it was great. I really enjoyed it to live abroad. Every day I felt alive and kicking. I learned so much. For instance, I made many failures, but even the failures I loved to embrace because I learned so much from it. One thing I learned, and that helped me to become an entrepreneur, that was that I learned abroad that you have to think in solutions and not in problems. And if you think in solutions, you're more successful, you get more energy, and it gives you more satisfaction. I really felt alive and kicking abroad. But then in 1999, I decided to return to the Netherlands. And I did that for the sake of my 3 young children. And it was, actually quite tough to return to the Netherlands. I found it quite a measured country, and it didn't give me a lot of imagination if I compare that with living abroad. But my life, I even had maybe a reverse culture shock. But I didn't have much time to stay in that feeling because I was in the rushing hours of my life. Because I was, for instance, picking up some management functions, I was writing some books, I quit my job to start some new ventures, and also I was bringing my children back and forth to school and clubs and friends, and for my feeling I was doing that endlessly. maybe one thing didn't change, and that was that I stayed with my wife. So I was quite proud of that, actually, when you are 39 of age. But around 2014, the rushing hours in my life were over, and that was because my children has left for study. And I started to get interested in the Netherlands and the history of the Netherlands. And then I saw a very important interview with the British historian Simon Schama in the fall of 2014. He was being interviewed on Dutch television, and he said that, that there was a fundamental weakness of trust in the world, and that the Netherlands should help to find a new paradigm for a very unstable world. And I found that extremely interesting. I mean, why was he giving so much responsibility to the Dutch? I mean, I was never aware of the fact that I never thought about the Dutch in that way. So I immersed myself in the DNA of the Dutch, and I started to read a lot of books from foreign historians who are much more pronounced about the contribution of the Dutch to world history. And then I was interested in the national genesis of the Netherlands, and I found three things that are maybe interesting to mention. First, there's of course the fight against the water. The strange thing was the inhabitants of the people who were living actually on this land of shifting clay had really difficulties in doing some agriculture. And they didn't leave this land, but they decided to go to Scandinavia to collect food for themselves, but they also took more food with them, and therefore we got the pile-up market in Amsterdam, and from there we started to trade. And in the height of the 17th century, the Netherlands were dominating 40% of world trade, so they were the hegemony of their times. I think the second thing which is important to mention, that is the fact that we were revolting against the Spanish king. The king wanted to impose higher taxes on the Dutch, and he was not accepting the privileges of the nobles in the Netherlands, and they revolted in 1568. And the interesting thing was they had the placard of Verlatingen, plakkaat van Verlatingen, and that was mentioned that the king was a shepherd who should protect his sheep. But if he's not doing that, he can be disposed. And that was what actually was happening. And this placard of Verlatingen is an extremely important historical document. I think it's one of the most important documents in modern times, because it's the beginning of the popular sovereignty and the democracy. And it is even a source of inspiration for the founding fathers of the United States. And it has been also an inspiration for Montesquieu, the French philosopher, for his Trias Politica, which is the basis for the Western democracy. And the last thing I would like to mention is the fact that the Netherlands has poor natural resources, and because of that, we have never had a strong ruler. The Netherlands was created from the bottom up and not from the top down. And that's quite a different with other countries. For instance, take France, which is a very central organized country. It are, in fact, the merchants and the artisans and the farmers who created this country. And that has also led to a society, a civil society, which is egalitarian and liberal. And that is also quite unique. And in 1648, the Netherlands was recognized by the European state system as the first civilian state in the world. And that is something from which we benefit until today. And what's even more important, we were struck in the bird kennel of our nation building for 80 years. And I was thinking, well, if I think of my own daughter, who was having it took her some hours in the bird kennel of her bird, and she came out as a very strong person. So you can imagine if you are struck in the bird kennel for 80 years, you get out very strong. And the positive characteristics of this are in fact that the Dutch are, that you can say they are they have anti-fatalism, pragmatism, they have openness and tolerance, they have self-consciousness and entrepreneurship, and they have a real feeling of freedom. And although the Dutch history has not been so spectacular anymore as in the 17th century, we were extremely successful, especially after the Second World War. The economist Jaap van Duin has calculated that, that in 70 years, the income per capita of the Dutch quadrupled, and it was twice as much as the prosperity in the 17th century. And therefore, you could say that we actually have witnessed a new highlight of the Dutch national history. And some people even say that this was a new golden era. But I think it's time to leave now the old familiar period of the last 400 years behind us, and we have to prepare ourselves for a new era. And I would like to mention a few challenges we will have to face. First, there is the climate change, which means that we have to evolve to a circular economy. The second thing is that there are very important technological developments. For instance, we will address the autonomy of the human being because of artificial intelligence. And then you have the social-cultural developments, which will question the architecture of our civil society. And then you have to think of developments like migration, integration, and aging of the population. But I'm convinced that we can actually face these challenges because of the strong Dutch characteristics of entrepreneurship and innovativeness. But there is a precondition. We have to embrace these Dutch characteristics because they are universal virtues. There have been the Canadian writer and scientist Michael Ignatieff had done a worldwide study, and he found out that these virtues the Dutch actually have are very important, are very applicable and inclusive for the world we are heading for. And what's also important, I think the Netherlands do know that this country is not a fact, but a decision, and therefore we have to reinvent and recreate ourselves and our nation on and on. And maybe, because of the time, I would like, that is by the way, that is me in the 60s with my parents, and they were very proud with their first car at the time, so that was an example of well, the enormous prosperity. But I would like to end with this person. This is Rodan Al-Ghalidi. And Rodan Al-Ghalidi is an Iraqi engineer and a writer who fled to the Netherlands. And he has said something very moving about the Dutch. So I would like to end with a final statement, what he has said about us, the Dutch. If I were the boss in Iraq, I would take 100,000 Dutch people to my homeland, and then, within 10 years, it would be the most beautiful country in the Middle East. The Dutch are so honest with taxes, with time, with appointments, with love and relationship. It is a miracle. Thank you very much.